The carriage rocked hard as it hit the broken road, and Alira Voss gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the horses outside. She was not running toward a wedding. She was running toward a stranger's house, and every mile brought her closer to a man the whole kingdom had chosen to forget. Her father had signed the papers 3 days earlier, in a candle-lit study that smelled of ink and desperation. The Voss trading family owed money to men who did not forgive debts. A marriage to a ruined duke was the only door left open, and Alira had walked through it because there was nothing else on the other side. She had never seen Duke Alastair Ashville. She had only heard the whispers. They called him the Forgotten Duke, a title spoken with a small curl of the lip, as if his very name was something distasteful to hold in the mouth. Some said his family had betrayed the crown decades ago. Others said the Ashville line had simply rotted from the inside, wasting away in a crumbling estate at the far edge of the kingdom, where no carriage bothered to travel unless it had no other choice. Alira's carriage was one of those carriages now. The estate appeared through the mist like something half swallowed by the earth. Tall iron gates, rusted at the hinges, stood open because there was no one left to guard them. The stone walls of the manor were gray and streaked with old rain, and ivy had climbed so high across one wing that it looked like the house itself was trying to hide. No servants lined the entrance. No banners hung from the towers. There was only silence and the sound of wind moving through broken shutters. Alira stepped down from the carriage before the driver could offer his hand. She smoothed the front of her travel dress, lifted her chin, and reminded herself of the promise she had made to no one but herself. She would not arrive here as a frightened girl. She would arrive as someone who intended to survive whatever came next. The front doors opened before she reached them. A man stood in the doorway, tall and still, dressed in a dark coat that had clearly once been fine and was now simply old. His hair was a deep, unremarkable brown, cut short and without care. His face was not unkind, but it was closed, like a door that had been shut so many times it had forgotten how to open. He did not smile. He did not step forward to greet her. "You must be Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low, quiet, careful, as if he had trained himself long ago to say as little as possible. "I am," Alira said, "and you must be the Duke." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "I am what remains of him," he said. "Welcome to Ashville such as it is." He turned and walked back into the house, without waiting to see if she followed. Alira stood on the front steps for one breath longer than she needed to, studying the tired stone and the empty windows. Then she followed him inside, because turning back was never an option that had belonged to her. The interior of the manor told its own story before anyone spoke a word. The entrance hall was vast, built for grandeur that no longer existed. A great chandelier hung overhead, half its candles missing, cobwebs threaded delicately between the crystal arms. Portraits lined the walls, their gold frames dulled with dust, faces of Ashville ancestors staring down at her with the same guarded expression she had just seen on the Duke's face. It was as if the whole family had been born wearing that look. "The staff left over the years," Alastair said, noticing her gaze move across the empty hall. "There was no coin to keep them and no reputation left to attract new ones. You will find only 3 people still working here. An old housekeeper, a groundsman, and a cook who is far too proud to admit her soup has grown thin." "And now a wife," Alira said. He stopped walking. For a moment he simply looked at her as if trying to decide whether she meant it as an accusation or a fact. "Yes," he said finally, "and now a wife." They were married 2 days later in a small chapel attached to the manor, with only the 3 remaining servants as witnesses. There were no flowers. There was no music. The priest spoke the words quickly, as though even he wanted the ceremony over before anyone changed their mind. Alira wore a dress she had brought from home, simple and unadorned, because there had been no time and no money for anything grander. Alastair wore the same dark coat from the day she arrived. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alastair did not kiss her. He only inclined his head, a small formal gesture, and said, "Thank you for agreeing to this." "I did not have much choice," Alira said honestly, but I intend to make the most of it regardless." Something almost like surprise crossed his face at her bluntness. It was the first real expression she had seen from him since her arrival. That evening they sat together at a long dining table built for 20 guests, though only the two of them occupied it. The meal was simple: bread and a thin stew, served by the elderly housekeeper, whose name Alira learned was Mrs. Holt. The woman moved slowly but with quiet dignity, refusing to apologize for the modest food, though her eyes carried a flicker of shame each time she set down another plain dish. Alira ate without complaint. She had grown up around merchants and traders, around people who understood that pride could not fill a stomach, but hard work eventually could. She was not raised to turn her nose up at simple food. She was raised to ask why the food was simple in the first place, and how that could be changed. "Tell me about the estate," she said, breaking the silence that had settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Alistair looked up from his plate, clearly startled by the request. "There is little to tell. The lands are wide but untended. The tenant farms pay less each year because the soil has not been properly managed in a decade. The family's trade agreements collapsed long before I was born. What remains is a title with no fortune attached to it, and a name that opens no doors. Why has nothing been done to fix it?" His jaw tightened. "Because fixing it would require money we do not have, connections we have lost, and a reputation strong enough to convince anyone to trust us again. None of those things exist for the Asheville name anymore." "They exist for the Voss name," Alira said calmly. "My family may not have titles, but we understand trade. We understand how to build something out of very little." Alistair studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You say that as though you intend to involve yourself in matters that are not your concern." "I am your wife now," Alira said. "That makes it entirely my concern." He did not answer. He simply returned to his meal, though Alira noticed his hand had stopped moving for a moment before he continued eating. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she filed it away all the same. This man was not made of stone, no matter how carefully he tried to appear that way. After dinner, Mrs. Holt showed Alira to her chambers, a modest room in the east wing with faded curtains and furniture that had clearly seen better decades. The housekeeper lingered at the door, wringing her apron between her hands. "Forgive the state of things, my lady," Mrs. Holt said quietly. "We do what we can with what little there is." "You have nothing to apologize for," Alira said. "I did not come here expecting a palace." Mrs. Holt studied her for a moment, something like cautious hope flickering across her tired face. "The Duke is a good man, my lady, whatever the gossips say. He has carried this family's shame on his shoulders since he was a boy of 12, when his father died and left him nothing but debts and a ruined name. He does not speak of it, but it has worn him down more than any of us like to admit." Alira absorbed this quietly. What happened to his father? Mrs. Holt's face closed, much like Alistair's had done earlier. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. You will have to ask the Duke himself, if he ever chooses to trust you enough to share it." That night Alira lay awake in the unfamiliar room, listening to the wind move through the old halls of Asheville Manor. She thought of her father's desperate face as he signed the marriage papers, of the debt collectors who had once come to her family's door with threats sharp enough to cut. She thought of Alistair's guarded eyes, and the way his voice had gone quiet when he spoke of his family's ruin. She had not asked for this marriage. She had not asked for a crumbling estate or a husband who spoke to her as though every word cost him something. But Alira Voss had never been the kind of person to sit quietly inside a problem when there was work to be done to solve it. She rose before dawn the next morning, dressed in practical clothing instead of anything fine, and made her way down to the kitchens before the household had fully woken. The cook, a stout woman named Greta, nearly dropped a pot in surprise at finding the new Duchess standing in her kitchen at such an early hour. "My lady, you should not trouble yourself with kitchen matters," Greta said quickly. "It is not fitting for someone of your position." "I am not troubling myself," Alira said, rolling up her sleeves. I am learning how this household actually runs from the ground up. I cannot fix what I do not understand." Greta blinked at her, clearly unused to a noblewoman speaking this way, but something in Alira's steady confidence seemed to ease her worry. By the time the sun had fully risen, Alira had learned exactly how little food remained in the stores, how few coins were left to purchase more, and how the tenant farms had not delivered their expected harvest shares in over a year. When she found Alistair later that morning in a small study lined with old ledgers, she wasted no time. "The tenant farms are failing," she said without greeting. "Not because the land is poor, but because no one has organized proper irrigation or crop rotation in years. The roads leading to the nearest market town are in disrepair, which means whatever crops are produced cannot be sold at fair prices, because merchants charge extra to risk the journey. And your household accounts have not been properly balanced in longer than I care to imagine." Alistair set down the ledger he had been studying, his expression somewhere between astonishment and wariness. "You have been awake for only a few hours, and already you have diagnosed problems it has taken me years to fully understand." "I did not diagnose anything new," Alira said. "I simply looked at what was already here with fresh eyes. You have been staring at the same broken pieces for so long that you have stopped seeing them as broken. You have simply learned to live around them." Something shifted in his face, a crack in the careful stillness he wore like armor. "And what would you have me do about it?" "Start small," Alira said. "The roads first. If we can repair even a portion of the main route to market, the tenant farmers will be able to sell their goods without losing half their profit to spoiled crops and desperate pricing. It will not fix everything, but it is a beginning." "And how do you propose we pay for road repairs, when we can barely afford bread?" Alira allowed herself a small, determined smile. "My family may not have titles, but we have connections in trade that your family has never had reason to use. I still have contacts from my father's business who owe him favors. I believe it is time to call some of them in." Alistair stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time since her arrival, Alira saw something other than guarded caution in his eyes. It was the faint, fragile beginning of hope, the kind a man allows himself only when he has been disappointed too many times to trust it fully. "You truly intend to involve yourself in all of this," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. "I told you last night," Alira said. "I am your wife now. That makes this my responsibility as much as yours. I did not travel across half the kingdom to sit quietly in a crumbling manor and watch it fall further into ruin. If we are bound together by this marriage, then we are bound together in fixing what is broken." Alistair was silent for a long moment, studying her the way a man studies a stranger who has just said something he has waited years to hear from someone, anyone, in his life. Then slowly, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not fully arrive. "Very well, Duchess," he said, testing the title carefully as though trying it on for the first time. "Where do we begin?" Outside the study window, the gray morning light was beginning to break through the clouds over Asheville Manor, falling across the untended gardens and the crumbling stone walls. It was not much of a beginning, but for a house that had been forgotten by the kingdom for so long, it was a beginning all the same, and Alira intended to make certain it was one the kingdom would eventually be forced to remember. The letter Alira wrote that morning traveled faster than either of them expected. Within 2 weeks, a response arrived from a merchant named Edwin Caro, an old associate of her father's who had built a modest fortune trading grain and timber along the eastern rivers. He remembered the Voss family fondly, and he remembered a debt of gratitude he had never fully repaid. He agreed to send a small team of workers and a modest supply of materials to begin repairing the road leading from Asheville Lands to the nearest market town, in exchange for first rights to purchase whatever surplus crops the estate produced once the harvest improved. It was not charity. It was trade, plain and practical, and that was exactly why Alistair found himself able to accept it without feeling the familiar sting of humiliation that came with pity. You understand this arrangement benefits him as much as it benefits us, Alira explained one evening, as they reviewed the agreement together in the study. He gains a reliable supplier before any of his rivals think to look this far east. We gain the road repairs we cannot currently afford ourselves. No one is doing anyone a favor out of kindness. This is simply good business. You make it sound so simple, Alistair said, though there was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of tired wonder. It often is simple, Alira said. People in your world tend to complicate everything with pride and politics. In my world we ask only one question: does this help both sides? If the answer is yes, the arrangement is worth making. Alistair leaned back in his chair, studying her across the cluttered desk. The candlelight softened the sharp lines of worry that usually sat across his brow. My father used to say something similar, long ago, before everything fell apart. He believed the Asheville name should be built on usefulness, not on old titles and older debts owed to us by other houses. I had almost forgotten he ever said such things. It was the first time he had mentioned his father directly. Alira kept her voice gentle, careful not to press too hard. What happened to him? Alistair's expression grew distant, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the moon hung pale and cold over the dark gardens. He died when I was 12. Officially, it was recorded as a hunting accident, though even as a child I knew there was more to the story than anyone would tell me. Shortly before his death, he had been in the middle of a dispute with Lord Edmund Draycott, over land boundaries and old trade rights that had belonged to our families for generations. The dispute ended abruptly, along with my father's life, and within a year the Asheville name had been quietly stripped of its influence at court. No one ever spoke openly of what happened. They simply stopped inviting us to anything that mattered. Alira felt a small chill move through her, though she kept her expression steady. You believe Lord Draycott was involved in your father's death? I have no proof, Alistair said quietly. Only a boy's memory of overheard arguments, and a lifetime of watching the Draycott family grow more powerful while mine faded into nothing. It is not something I can accuse anyone of without evidence. And evidence, if it ever existed, has had 18 years to disappear. Then we will look for it, Alira said simply. Alistair's gaze snapped back to her, sharp with surprise. Alira, this is not a road repair or a grain contract. This is a matter that could bring real danger to this house if handled carelessly. The Draycotts are among the most influential families at court. If they believe we are digging into old accusations, they will not hesitate to crush whatever remains of the Asheville name entirely. Then we will be careful, Alira said, unbothered by the warning in his voice. But I did not marry into this family to watch you carry an old wound in silence for the rest of your life. If there is truth buried somewhere in your father's death, it deserves to be found, not out of vengeance, but out of fairness. You have spent 18 years being punished for a crime that may not even belong to your family. That is not justice. That is simply convenient forgetting, and I do not intend to let convenient forgetting stand unchallenged. For a long moment, Alistair said nothing. He simply looked at her, and Alira could see the careful walls he had built around himself trembling slightly, as though unused to being addressed with such open determination on his behalf. Why do you care so much? He asked finally, his voice quieter than before. We are little more than strangers bound together by a contract neither of us chose freely. Alira considered the question honestly before answering. Perhaps because I understand what it feels like to be dismissed before anyone bothers to learn the full truth of your situation. When my father's business began to struggle, people who once respected him started treating our family as though our misfortune was somehow deserved, as though poverty were a character flaw rather than simply bad circumstances layered upon bad luck. I grew up watching good, hardworking people be judged unfairly, simply because judging them was easier than understanding them. I will not stand by and let that happen to you as well, not while there is something I can do about it. Alistair was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth Alira had not yet heard from him. Thank you, he said simply. I did not expect kindness from this arrangement. I expected obligation, perhaps tolerance at best. I did not expect someone who would choose to fight for a name that is not even truly hers. It is mine now, Elira said. For better or worse, I married into this family. That means the Asheville name is my responsibility to protect as much as yours. Over the following weeks, the estate began to show small, stubborn signs of life. The road repairs progressed steadily, funded by Edwin Caro's materials, and worked by a mix of local laborers glad for honest wages after years of scarcity. Elira spent her mornings walking the tenant farms herself, speaking directly with the farmers, many of whom had never once been visited by a member of the Asheville family in their entire lives. She listened to their complaints about poor irrigation, outdated tools, and unfair rent structures left over from decades of neglect. And she began drafting practical solutions, adjusting rent terms to reward improved yields rather than punishing farmers for circumstances beyond their control. Alastair, watching his wife move through his own lands with more familiarity and purpose than he had managed in years, began to change as well. He started accompanying her on these visits, at first simply observing, then gradually participating, asking questions of the farmers himself, learning names he had never bothered to learn before. The tenants, wary at first of a duke who had rarely shown his face among them, slowly began to warm toward him, especially as they watched him listen rather than lecture. One afternoon, as they walked back from a visit to the northern farms, Alastair spoke without prompting. "I used to believe there was nothing left to save here," he admitted. "I believed the Asheville name was simply a burden I was destined to carry until it eventually crumbled entirely, taking me down with it. I had made peace with that fate, or told myself I had." "And now?" Elira asked. He glanced at her, and for the first time since her arrival, something like genuine warmth touched his tired eyes. "Now I am beginning to wonder if perhaps I simply needed someone willing to remind me that giving up was never the only option available." Elira smiled, though she kept her tone practical, unwilling to let the moment grow too soft too quickly. "Giving up was never an option I was prepared to accept, regardless of how this marriage began. We still have a great deal of work ahead of us." "I am aware," Alastair said, and this time the smile that touched his mouth was genuine, unguarded, the first true smile Elira had seen from him since her arrival at Asheville Manor. "But for the first time in a very long while, I find myself looking forward to the work, rather than dreading it." That evening, over a dinner that included, for the first time, a proper roasted chicken purchased with proceeds from the estate's first successful trade shipment, Alastair raised his cup toward Elira in a small, informal toast. "To the Duchess who refuses to let a name stay forgotten," he said. Elira raised her own cup to meet his. "To the Duke who is finally ready to fight for it." Outside, the estate remained far from restored, its walls still worn, its fortunes still fragile. But within those old stone halls, something had shifted that neither of them could easily name. A marriage that had begun as a transaction born of desperation was slowly, carefully, becoming something neither of them had expected to find. And though neither spoke the word aloud, something resembling partnership, and perhaps even the earliest seeds of trust, had quietly begun to take root between them, strong enough to weather whatever the Draycotts, or the rest of the kingdom, might eventually throw in their path. The letters began arriving at Asheville Manor with unusual frequency, carried by riders who no longer looked embarrassed to be seen approaching its gates. Begun to spread through the merchant circles of the eastern rivers that the Asheville lands, once considered worthless, were producing grain of surprising quality, delivered on time along a newly repaired road that made trade with the estate far less risky than it had once been. Elira read each letter carefully at the long dining table, now cleared of dust, and set each evening with simple but proper meals, while Alastair reviewed the ledgers beside her, his handwriting steadier than it had been in years. It was Mrs. Holt who first mentioned the name that would soon change everything. "There is a rumor circulating among the market traders, my lady," the housekeeper said one morning, setting down a tray of tea with visibly nervous hands. "They say Lord Edmund Draycott has taken notice of the Asheville estate's recent successes. It is said he does not approve. Alira set down her teacup carefully, exchanging a glance with Alistair across the table. What exactly has he said? Nothing directly, my lady. But one of the grounds workers has a cousin employed at Draycott Hall, and word passed along suggests Lord Draycott has been asking pointed questions about who is supplying materials and coin to this estate, and why. Alistair's expression darkened, the old caution returning to his eyes like a familiar shadow. He does not like being reminded that the Asheville name still exists, he said quietly. For 18 years, he has enjoyed a kingdom that has forgotten us entirely. Our recovery threatens that comfort. Then we continue as we have been, Alira said firmly, though her pulse had quickened at the news. We have done nothing wrong. We have built honest trade agreements and repaired what was broken through nothing but hard work. If Lord Draycott has a problem with that, it says a great deal more about his character than it does about ours. You do not understand the Draycotts, Alistair said, his voice low. They do not simply have problems with things. They act upon them quietly, patiently, until the problem no longer exists. My father learned that lesson at the cost of his life. Alira reached across the table, resting her hand briefly over his, a gesture that had become more natural between them in recent weeks, though it still carried a certain careful tenderness, as though both of them were still learning the shape of this new closeness. Then we will simply have to be more patient and more careful than they are, she said. We have already begun asking quiet questions of our own about your father's death. Perhaps it is time to press further, before Draycott decides to act against us first. Over the following days, Alira turned her attention toward the investigation she had promised weeks earlier. She began with Mrs. Holt, gently coaxing loose memories the older woman had long kept buried out of fear and loyalty. Mrs. Holt recalled the final months before the old Duke's death with painful clarity, describing heated meetings between Alistair's father and Lord Draycott regarding a disputed stretch of land along the river border, separating their two estates, land that contained valuable mineral deposits neither family had fully understood the worth of at the time. The old Duke believed the boundary markers had been moved, Mrs. Holt explained quietly, glancing nervously toward the study door as though the walls themselves might carry word back to Draycott Hall. He accused Lord Draycott of shifting them years earlier to steal land that rightfully belonged to the Asheville estate. Lord Draycott denied it fiercely. The dispute grew ugly in the weeks before the accident. Do you know if any records of the original boundary survives? Alira asked. There was an old survey map, my lady, kept in the estate archive. I have not seen it in years, though. Much of the archive fell into disorder after the old Duke passed. I cannot say for certain it still exists. That afternoon, Alira and Alistair descended together into the estate's neglected archive room, a chamber beneath the west wing filled with decades of disorganized documents, ledgers, and forgotten family records, all coated in a thick layer of dust that spoke of years without a single visitor. They spent hours sorting through crumbling papers by candlelight, searching for any trace of the old survey. It was Alistair who finally found it, tucked inside a leather folder mislabeled among a stack of unrelated tax records. The survey map was old, its edges brittle, but the boundary lines were still clearly drawn, dated nearly 20 years before Alistair's father's death, marking the river border precisely where the old Duke had claimed it belonged. This proves the original boundary, Alistair said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion as he studied the faded ink. If this is genuine, then Draycott's family has been illegally holding Asheville land for nearly 2 decades and profiting from mineral rights that never belonged to them. It proves the boundary, Alira said carefully, but it does not prove what happened to your father or why. We need more than a survey map. We need something connecting Draycott directly to the events surrounding his death, or this discovery alone will simply give him more reason to act against us before we can bring it before the king. Alistair nodded slowly, folding the fragile map with careful hands. Then we continue searching, quietly, and we prepare ourselves because once Draycott learns we possess this, he will not sit idle and wait to see what we intend to do with it. That warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. Within a week, the estate's newly repaired road, the very lifeline Alira had worked so hard to establish, was suddenly and mysteriously blocked by a fallen section of bridge along its most critical stretch, cutting off the flow of goods to market entirely. When Alastair sent workers to investigate and repair the damage, they discovered the collapse had not been natural. The support beams had been deliberately weakened, sawed through just enough to appear like an accident to anyone who did not look closely. Around the same time, two of Edwin Caro's usual merchant contacts abruptly canceled their standing agreements with the Asheville estate, offering vague and unconvincing excuses about shifting business priorities. Alira recognized the pattern immediately, having grown up around enough trade politics to know intimidation when she saw it disguised as coincidence. "He is testing us," she said grimly, standing beside Alastair at the edge of the broken bridge, watching workers assess the damage in the fading evening light. "He wants to see how much pressure it takes before we back away quietly, the way he expects an Asheville to behave." "Then we will not give him the satisfaction," Alastair said, and there was something new in his voice, a hardened resolve that had not existed in the tired, guarded man Alira had first met. "We repair the bridge ourselves, faster and stronger than before. We find new merchant contacts to replace the ones he has frightened away. And we continue our search for the truth about my father, no matter how carefully Draycott attempts to bury it." Alira looked at her husband in the fading light, seeing not the forgotten duke the kingdom had dismissed for so long, but a man slowly reclaiming the strength that had always belonged to him, buried beneath years of grief and isolation. "You sound like a man who no longer intends to hide," she said quietly. "I have you to thank for that," Alastair said, and though his voice remained steady, something softer moved behind his eyes. "You arrived at this house a stranger bound to me by nothing but necessity, and yet you have given me more reason to fight for this name than I have felt in 18 years. "Then let us fight for it properly," Alira said, "starting with this bridge and ending eventually with the truth." The repairs began the very next morning, funded quietly through Alira's remaining connections, and completed within days through the tireless effort of workers who had grown genuinely loyal to the young Duchess, who had treated them with more respect and fairness than any noble family in living memory. New merchant contacts were secured through careful negotiation, wary at first of Draycott's influence, but ultimately persuaded by the genuine quality and reliability of Asheville trade goods. But the greater search continued in careful secrecy. Alira began writing discreet letters to old family friends of her father's who had connections within court circles, gently inquiring about anyone who might recall the details surrounding the old duke's death nearly 2 decades earlier. She was careful in her wording, never mentioning Draycott directly, aware that a single misplaced word could reach the wrong ears and destroy whatever fragile progress they had made. Weeks passed with no significant breakthrough, though the estate itself continued its slow, steady recovery. The harvest that season proved the strongest Asheville lands had produced in over a decade, and word of the estate's resurgence began spreading beyond simple merchant circles, reaching, eventually, the edges of the royal court itself, where a name once spoken with quiet dismissal began, cautiously, to be spoken again with something resembling curiosity. It was during this period of careful, patient rebuilding that a response finally arrived that would change the course of everything that followed. An old retired steward, once employed at Draycott Hall during the years surrounding Alastair's father's death, replied to Alira's careful inquiries with a letter far more direct than she had expected, written by a man who claimed to be dying and no longer afraid of the consequences of speaking truth. The letter contained a single name Alira had not anticipated, a witness who had allegedly seen something on the night of the old duke's death that had never been included in any official record, a witness who, according to the retired steward, still lived quietly in a small village not 2 days' ride from Asheville Manor. Alira read the letter twice before bringing it to Alastair, her hands trembling slightly with the weight of what it might mean. "I believe," she said quietly, setting the letter before him, that we have finally found our first true thread toward the truth. Alistair read the letter in silence, his face pale in the candlelight, 18 years of buried grief and unanswered questions rising visibly to the surface. When he finally looked up, his eyes carried a fierce, quiet determination Alira had never seen in him before. "Then we ride at first light," he said. "It is time I finally learned what truly happened to my father." The village of Hollow Bend sat quietly between two low hills, a scattering of modest cottages and a single church whose bell tower could be seen from nearly a mile away. Alira and Alistair arrived shortly after midday, their horses tired from the 2-day journey, their traveling clothes plain and unremarkable by design. Alistair had insisted they travel without any mark of their true identity, unwilling to risk word reaching Draycott Hall before they had a chance to speak with the witness named in the steward's letter. The woman they sought was called Agnes Miller, an elderly widow who had once served as a kitchen maid at Draycott Hall during the years surrounding the old Duke's death. She now lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of the village, tending a modest garden that seemed to be the whole of her world. She answered the door cautiously when Alistair knocked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion at the sight of two strangers standing on her step. "We do not get many visitors here," she said, her voice thin but steady. "State your business plainly or move along." "My name is Alistair Asheville," he said quietly, watching her expression carefully. "I believe you may have information about my father's death nearly 18 years ago." Agnes Miller went very still, her weathered face draining of what little color it held. For a long moment she said nothing at all, simply staring at Alistair as though seeing a ghost standing on her doorstep. Then slowly she stepped aside and gestured them into her small home. "I wondered if this day would ever come," she said, closing the door firmly behind them. "I am an old woman now, my lord. I have carried this secret long enough that it has become a heavier burden than I believe I can carry into my grave." She sat them at a small wooden table and with trembling hands poured tea she did not seem to fully register making. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of silence. "I was working in the kitchens at Draycott Hall the night before your father died, my lord. I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear, between Lord Edmund Draycott and a man I did not recognize, someone Lord Draycott addressed only as his hired hand. They spoke of arranging an accident during the following day's hunting party, an accident meant to look natural, meant to ensure a particular dispute would end permanently rather than through the courts." Alistair's hands, resting on the table, had curled into tight fists, though his voice remained remarkably controlled when he spoke. "You are certain of what you heard?" "As certain as I am sitting here before you now, my lord," Agnes said. "I was young then and terrified. I said nothing to anyone because I knew what happened to servants who spoke against powerful families. I left Draycott Hall within the month, using an excuse about caring for an ailing relative, and I never returned. I have lived quietly ever since, hoping the truth would somehow find its own way into the light without requiring anything further from me." "Why speak now?" Alira asked gently. Agnes's eyes glistened with sudden tears. "Because I heard only recently that the Asheville name was finally rising again, that the young Duke had married a clever young woman who was rebuilding what had been broken. I thought perhaps if there was ever a moment when the truth might actually matter, when it might actually change something, that moment had finally arrived. I am old, my lady. I do not fear Lord Draycott's anger any longer. I fear only dying with this secret still unspoken." Alistair reached across the table, gently taking the old woman's trembling hand in his own. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he had clearly held contained for 18 long years. "You cannot know what this means to me." "Will you testify to this before the king if necessary?" Alira asked carefully. "I understand the risk that would place upon you." Agnes considered the question for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the small window overlooking her modest garden. "I am an old widow with no family left to protect, my lady. Lord Draycott has already taken nearly everything from me that mattered, simply through my own silence and fear. I believe I am finally ready to take something back. Yes. I will testify, if it means the truth finally reaches those who deserve to hear it. They remained in Hollow Bend 2 additional days, during which Alira carefully documented Agnes's account in writing, having the elderly woman sign and seal the statement in the presence of the village priest as an additional witness, ensuring the testimony would hold weight beyond simple word of mouth. It was not, on its own, sufficient proof to bring formal charges against Lord Draycott, but combined with the old survey map proving the disputed boundary, it formed the beginning of a case substantial enough to finally challenge 18 years of carefully maintained silence. The journey home carried a different weight than the journey out it held. Alistair rode beside Alira in contemplative silence for much of the first day, processing 18 years of buried grief now given sudden, painful shape and substance. "I always suspected," he said finally, as they made camp for the night beside a quiet stream. "Even as a boy, I felt it in my bones that my father's death was not the simple accident everyone insisted it was. But suspecting something and finally hearing it confirmed by a living witness are entirely different burdens to carry." "You do not have to carry it alone any longer," Alira said, settling beside him near the small fire they had built. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Alistair turned to look at her, the firelight softening the weary lines that had settled across his face over the course of the long day. "I did not expect this, you know. Any of it. When your father's letter first arrived those months ago, arranging our marriage, I believed I was simply accepting one final obligation before watching the last of the Asheville name quietly disappear. I never imagined I would find someone willing to fight this hard for a family that was not even her own by birth. It became my own the moment I married into it," Alira said simply. "And I do not abandon what belongs to me, Alistair, whether that is a struggling estate, a broken road, or a husband still learning how to believe good things can happen to him again." Something shifted in Alistair's expression, warm and unguarded in a way Alira had rarely witnessed from him. Slowly, carefully, as though asking permission with the gesture itself, he reached over and took her hand in his. "I believe," he said quietly, "that somewhere between the broken bridges and the old survey maps, I have fallen in love with my wife." Alira felt her breath catch, surprised by both the sincerity in his voice and the warmth blooming unexpectedly in her own chest in response. "That is fortunate," she said softly, "because I believe I have fallen in love with my husband as well, somewhere between the tenant farms and the long nights spent searching through old family archives." They remained beside the quiet stream a while longer, the weight of 18 years of buried grief now balanced, for the first time, against the growing warmth of a partnership neither of them had expected to find. But both had come to treasure more deeply than either could have predicted when Alira's carriage had first arrived at the crumbling gates of Asheville Manor. But the peace of that quiet evening would not last long. When they returned to Asheville Manor 2 days later, they found Mrs. Holt waiting anxiously at the front steps, her face pale with worry. "My lord, my lady," she said quickly, before either of them had fully dismounted. "A formal letter arrived from Draycott Hall while you were away. Lord Edmund Draycott has requested an audience with you both, at his estate, within the week. The letter states the matter concerns, and I quote, certain troubling rumors regarding unauthorized inquiries into private family matters." Alistair and Alira exchanged a long, steady look, understanding passing silently between them without need for words. Draycott knew they were searching, and now, it seemed, he intended to confront them directly before they had the opportunity to bring their evidence before the king. "Then we accept his invitation," Alira said firmly, her voice steady despite the danger clearly gathering on the horizon. "But we go prepared, and we go together." Alistair nodded slowly, his expression hardening into the same quiet resolve Alira had come to recognize as the true strength hidden beneath his years of guarded caution. "Yes," he said. "It is time Lord Draycott learned that the forgotten Duke does not intend to remain forgotten or silent any longer." Draycott Hall rose from its surrounding hills like a monument to power that had never once been questioned. Its towers taller, and its grounds far grander than anything Asheville Manor had possessed even in its finest years. Alira felt the weight of that grandeur pressing against her the moment their carriage passed through the estate's polished iron gates, though she was careful not to let any trace of intimidation show on her face. She had learned, over her months at Asheville, that appearing unafraid was often half the battle in any negotiation. Lord Edmund Draycott received them in a vast receiving hall lined with portraits of his own ancestors, each frame gilded far more richly than anything in the Asheville archives. He was an older man, silver-haired and sharply dressed, with the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him stood his daughter, Lady Priscilla Draycott, a young woman of striking beauty whose expression carried the same careful, calculating quality as her father's, though she said nothing as the introductions were made. "Duke Asheville," Lord Draycott said smoothly, extending a hand that Alastair shook with visible restraint, "and the new Duchess. I have heard a great deal about your recent efforts to restore your estate. Quite ambitious for a family with such limited resources." "We have found that ambition tends to accomplish more than resignation," Alira said pleasantly, refusing to let the subtle insult land as intended. "Though I imagine you understand the value of ambition quite well yourself, given your own family's considerable success." Something flickered behind Lord Draycott's eyes, a flash of irritation quickly smoothed back into practiced composure. "Indeed, though I confess, I invited you here today with a specific concern in mind. It has come to my attention that certain inquiries have been made recently, inquiries touching upon old family matters that were settled and closed many years ago. I find such digging into the past rather unnecessary, and frankly, unbecoming of a house attempting to rebuild its reputation." "The past has a way of remaining unfinished," Alastair said, his voice steady despite the tension visibly tightening his shoulders, "when the truth surrounding it was never fully brought to light in the first place." Lord Draycott's smile did not waver, though his eyes grew noticeably colder. "Your father's death was a tragic accident, Duke Asheville. I understand the desire, even after so many years, to seek some deeper meaning behind such a loss. Grief has a way of inventing conspiracies where none exist. But I would caution you strongly against pursuing wild accusations that could damage both our families unnecessarily." "We have not made any accusations," Alira said calmly. "We have simply been gathering information, as any family might, regarding matters that directly concern them." "Information," Lord Draycott repeated, his tone sharpening slightly. "Gathered from unreliable sources, I imagine. Old servants with fading memories, desperate for relevance in their final years. I would advise you both to consider carefully whether such sources are worth risking the fragile progress your estate has recently made." The threat, though carefully wrapped in polite language, was unmistakable. Alira felt Alastair tense beside her, and she reached over subtly to rest a steadying hand against his arm before he could respond with the anger clearly building behind his controlled expression. "We appreciate your concern for our estate's progress, Lord Draycott," Alira said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough steel beneath its politeness to make her meaning clear. "But I believe you will find that the Asheville family no longer intends to remain silent regarding matters that affect its own history and honor, regardless of any discomfort that silence's absence might cause elsewhere." Lady Priscilla Draycott spoke for the first time since their arrival, her voice smooth and measured. "You speak boldly, Duchess, for someone whose family arrived at their current title through little more than a financial arrangement rather than true noble blood. I wonder if such boldness is truly wise, given how quickly reputations can be undone in certain circles." "Boldness has served my family well thus far," Alira replied without missing a beat. "And I have found that reputations built on genuine work tend to withstand scrutiny far better than reputations built on old titles and carefully maintained silence." The room grew noticeably cooler at her words, Lord Draycott's composed expression finally cracking just enough to reveal the sharp anger simmering beneath it. "I believe this audience has run its course," he said stiffly. "I trust you will consider carefully the advice I have offered today, Duke Asheville, Duchess. Old wounds are best left undisturbed. Reopening them tends to cause damage far beyond what anyone originally intended." The ride back to Asheville Manor passed in tense silence for the first several miles, both Alastair and Alira processing the thinly veiled threats they had just endured. It was Alastair who finally spoke, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "He all but confirmed his involvement," he said. "Did you notice how quickly he moved to discredit Agnes Miller's testimony before we had even mentioned her name directly? He knows exactly who spoke to us and exactly what she told us." "I noticed," Alira said grimly. "Which means he also likely knows we possess the old survey map and understands precisely how dangerous that evidence could become for him if it ever reaches the king's attention. We need to move quickly now, Alastair. He will not simply wait to see what we do next. Men like him act preemptively." Her words proved painfully accurate within days. The estate's newly secured merchant contacts began receiving quiet, unofficial warnings against continuing their trade agreements with Asheville lands. Warnings that traced back, through careful investigation, to subtle pressure applied by Draycott's considerable influence throughout the region's merchant circles. Worse still, a formal letter arrived at Asheville Manor from a royal magistrate, informing Alastair that questions had been raised regarding the legitimacy of certain boundary claims recently circulated in local gossip. Questions that, if pursued formally, could result in an official investigation into Alastair's own conduct rather than Lord Draycott's. "He is attempting to turn the accusation against us before we can bring our own evidence forward," Alira said, reading the magistrate's letter with growing alarm. "If he successfully paints us as the ones spreading false claims, any evidence we eventually present will be dismissed as an act of desperate retaliation rather than genuine pursuit of justice." Alastair paced the length of the study, his earlier hesitance now fully replaced by fierce determination. "Then we cannot wait any longer to act. We must bring what evidence we have directly before the king ourselves, before Draycott's preemptive maneuvering succeeds in discrediting us entirely." "Agreed," Alira said. "But we need more than the survey map and Agnes Miller's testimony alone. We need something connecting Draycott more directly to the arrangement she overheard, something that removes any possibility of the accusation being dismissed as mere hearsay." It was Greta, of all people, who unexpectedly provided the next crucial thread. The cook mentioned, almost in passing one evening while serving dinner, that her own brother had once worked as a stable hand at Draycott Hall during the very same period surrounding the old Duke's death, before eventually taking a position at a neighboring estate. Alira wasted no time following up on the connection, traveling personally to speak with Greta's brother, a quiet, weathered man named Samuel, who initially proved reluctant to discuss anything related to his former employer. It took considerable patience and careful reassurance before Samuel finally opened up, revealing a detail that had haunted him silently for 18 years. He recalled preparing a horse late one evening for an unfamiliar rider who had arrived at Draycott Hall under cover of darkness. A rider Lord Draycott had personally met and spoken with in hushed, urgent tones near the stable entrance, the very night before Alastair's father's fatal hunting accident occurred. Samuel had never known the rider's identity, but he distinctly remembered Lord Draycott pressing a heavy purse of coin into the stranger's hand before he departed into the night. "I always wondered," Samuel admitted quietly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he spoke, "whether that rider had something to do with what happened the following day. But I was young and frightened of losing my position, and I told myself it was simply none of my concern." Alira carefully documented Samuel's account as well, securing his signature alongside a village witness, just as she had done with Agnes Miller's testimony. Combined together, the survey map, Agnes Miller's overheard conversation, and Samuel's account of the mysterious late-night visitor formed a case substantial enough, Alira believed, to finally challenge 18 years of carefully constructed silence, provided they could bring it before the king before Lord Draycott succeeded in discrediting them first. When she returned to Asheville Manor and laid the full collection of evidence before Alastair, he studied each document in careful silence, the weight of 18 years finally beginning to feel, for the first time, like something that might actually be lifted rather than simply endured. "This is enough," he said finally, his voice steady with quiet determination. "This is enough to finally demand the truth be heard." "Then we request a formal audience with the king," Alira said, "before Draycott's magistrate friends succeed in turning suspicion against us instead." Alastair looked up at her, and in his eyes, Alira saw not the guarded, resigned man she had first met at the crumbling gates of Asheville Manor, but someone finally ready to reclaim everything that had been unjustly taken from his family 18 long years ago. "Together," he said. "Together," Alira agreed, and outside the study window, the estate that had once been forgotten by the entire kingdom stood quietly waiting ready at last to reclaim its rightful place. The request for a royal audience did not travel quietly. Within days of Alastair submitting his formal petition through the proper court channels, word of the pending inquiry began circulating through noble houses across the kingdom, carried by the same gossiping tongues that had once dismissed the Asheville name as unworthy of attention. Now those same tongues buzzed with a different kind of interest, drawn by the rare spectacle of a forgotten house daring to challenge one of the most powerful families at court. Lord Draycott did not remain passive in the face of this development. Within a week, Alira and Alastair began noticing a coordinated campaign designed to undermine their credibility before they ever reached the king's chambers. Whispers circulated at social gatherings suggesting the Asheville family had fabricated evidence out of bitter jealousy toward Draycott's success. A minor noble, clearly acting on Draycott's behalf, publicly questioned the character of the witnesses Alira had gathered, suggesting an elderly widow and a former stable hand were hardly reliable sources against a family of Draycott's standing. Worse, one evening, as Alastair reviewed the estate's trade ledgers in the study, a messenger arrived bearing an unmarked letter, delivered without any official seal. The message inside was brief and unmistakably threatening in its careful restraint. It warned, in vague but pointed language, that pursuing this matter further would ensure the Asheville name suffered consequences far more severe than mere financial ruin, consequences that would extend beyond Alastair himself to anyone he held dear. Alastair's hands trembled as he read the letter a second time before showing it to Alira, his face pale with barely restrained fury and fear combined. "This is meant for you as much as for me," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Alira, I cannot allow this to place you in danger. Perhaps we should reconsider how we proceed." Alira took the letter from his hands, reading its careful, cowardly threat with a steady expression that masked the genuine fear rising in her own chest. "This letter tells us exactly one thing," she said finally, setting it down with deliberate calm. "It tells us that Draycott is afraid. Men who feel secure in their innocence do not send anonymous threats. He sent this because he knows our evidence is strong enough to genuinely threaten him, and he is desperate to stop us before it reaches the king." "Desperate men are dangerous," Alastair said. "They are," Alira agreed. "Which is exactly why we cannot afford to hesitate now. If we back away out of fear, we hand him exactly the victory he is trying to force. We continue forward, Alastair, but we take precautions. We ensure our witnesses remain protected, and we ensure this letter itself becomes part of the evidence we present, proof of the very intimidation we have been enduring throughout this entire process." Alastair studied her for a long moment, and slowly the fear in his eyes gave way once again to the same fierce resolve Alira had watched steadily grow within him over the preceding months. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "Most people would have fled the moment real danger appeared. You simply find another way forward." "Running has never solved anything in my experience," Alira said. "It only postpones the reckoning that eventually comes regardless." They took immediate steps to protect Agnes Miller and Samuel, arranging for both witnesses to be quietly relocated to Asheville Manor itself under the watchful protection of loyal estate workers, ensuring Draycott could not attempt to silence them before the royal audience occurred. Mrs. Holt, Greta, and the small but fiercely loyal household staff rallied around the effort with a determination that surprised even Alira, each of them contributing whatever assistance they could offer, driven by a genuine devotion to the young couple who had treated them with more respect and dignity than the Asheville name had shown its own household in generations. The royal audience was finally granted 3 weeks later, scheduled to take place within the grand hall of the king's own palace, before an assembly of court officials and interested noble witnesses. The morning of the audience arrived cold and clear, and Alira dressed with careful deliberation, choosing a gown of deep, dignified blue that spoke of quiet confidence rather than desperate ambition. Alastair, standing beside her as their carriage approached the palace gates, looked more like the Duke his father had once been than the guarded, resigned man Alira had first encountered months earlier at the crumbling gates of Asheville Manor. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, taking her hand as the carriage slowed to a stop, "I want you to know that finding you has already changed everything for me, regardless of how the king ultimately rules." "We are not finished yet," Alira said, squeezing his hand firmly. "Let us go prove exactly what the Asheville name is truly capable of." The grand hall was already crowded with curious nobility by the time they entered, whispers rippling through the assembled crowd as the forgotten Duke and his determined young Duchess made their way toward the front of the chamber. Lord Draycott stood near the opposite side of the hall, flanked by his daughter and several allies, his composed expression betraying only the faintest trace of tension beneath its carefully maintained surface. King Edward himself sat upon the raised dais at the head of the hall, an older man with sharp, observant eyes that missed very little of what occurred within his court. He regarded both parties with careful neutrality as the formal proceedings began. "Duke Asheville," the king said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "you have petitioned this court with grave accusations against Lord Draycott regarding the death of your father nearly 18 years ago. I trust you understand the seriousness of such claims and the evidence required to substantiate them before this court." "I understand fully, Your Majesty," Alastair said, stepping forward with steady composure. "And I believe the evidence we bring today will demonstrate that seriousness clearly." Alira presented the case alongside her husband, her voice clear and measured, as she laid out each piece of evidence methodically before the assembled court. She began with the old survey map, demonstrating the original boundary lines that proved the disputed land had rightfully belonged to the Asheville estate for generations before being quietly and illegally absorbed into Draycott Holdings. She then presented Agnes Miller's sworn testimony, read aloud by the elderly widow herself, whose trembling but determined voice carried unmistakable sincerity as she described the conversation she had overheard nearly 2 decades earlier. Samuel followed, offering his own account of the mysterious late-night visitor and the exchange of coin he had witnessed the evening before the fatal hunting accident. Finally, Alira presented the anonymous threatening letter itself, explaining the timing of its arrival and its unmistakable connection to their pending investigation. "A man confident in his innocence, Your Majesty," Alira said, her voice steady and clear across the silent hall, "does not resort to anonymous threats against a family simply seeking the truth. This letter alone speaks volumes about the guilt Lord Draycott has spent 18 years carefully concealing." Lord Draycott, given the opportunity to respond, attempted to dismiss the evidence with practiced confidence, questioning the reliability of elderly servants and suggesting the survey map itself could easily be a forgery crafted to discredit his family unfairly. But as he spoke, Alira watched the assembled court's expression shift subtly, doubt creeping visibly into faces that had once regarded the Asheville claims with dismissive skepticism. It was King Edward himself who finally posed the question that shifted the balance of the entire proceeding. "Lord Draycott," the king said, his measured voice carrying an edge of sharp scrutiny, If this survey map is indeed a forgery, as you claim, then perhaps you would be willing to submit your own family's original land records for comparison, to settle the boundary question definitively. A visible flicker of panic crossed Lord Draycott's composed features before he could fully suppress it, a hesitation the entire court clearly noticed. Your Majesty, those records may have been lost over the years, misplaced during various estate reorganizations. How convenient, the king said dryly, and a ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the assembled nobility. The audience stretched well into the afternoon, with additional witnesses called and further questions posed, the momentum of the proceedings steadily shifting away from Lord Draycott's carefully maintained composure. By the time King Edward finally called for a recess to consider his judgment, it was clear to nearly everyone present that the forgotten duke's carefully gathered evidence had accomplished something the kingdom had not witnessed in nearly 2 decades. It had cracked, for the first time, the untouchable reputation Lord Edmund Draycott had spent 18 years building atop a foundation of buried lies. Alira and Alastair stood together near the edge of the grand hall during the recess, exhausted but quietly hopeful, watching as court officials moved through the chamber preparing for the king's eventual return and final ruling. Whatever the king decides, Alastair said quietly, taking Alira's hand in his own, you have already given me something I believed I had lost forever, the moment my father died all those years ago. What is that? Alira asked. The truth, Alastair said, and the courage to finally stand and demand it be heard. Across the hall, Lord Draycott watched them with narrowed, calculating eyes, already, Alira suspected, beginning to consider his next move, regardless of whatever judgment the king might soon deliver. The battle, she understood clearly, was far from fully won. But for the first time in 18 long years, the truth had finally found its way into the light, and no amount of Draycott's remaining influence could fully force it back into darkness again. The recess stretched for nearly 2 hours, during which the grand hall buzzed with quiet, urgent conversation among the assembled nobility. Alira noticed several court members who had once regarded her, and Alastair with polite indifference, now glancing their way with newfound curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands as they reconsidered 18 years of accepted history in light of the evidence just presented. Lord Draycott remained near the far side of the chamber, his composure visibly strained as several of his usual allies seemed to distance themselves subtly from his side, unwilling to be too closely associated with a man whose innocence had just been publicly called into question before the entire court. When King Edward finally returned to the dais, the hall fell into immediate, expectant silence. The king's expression was unreadable as he settled into his seat, surveying the assembled crowd with the same sharp, careful attention he had shown throughout the entire proceeding. I have considered the evidence presented today with great care, the king began, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. The survey map, the sworn testimonies, and the troubling nature of the anonymous threat received by Duke Asheville during the course of this investigation. While I cannot, based on testimony alone, issue a formal ruling of guilt regarding the precise circumstances of the late Duke Asheville's death so many years ago, I find the evidence regarding the disputed land boundary to be conclusive and undeniable. A ripple of tension moved through the hall as the king continued. The boundary lines clearly documented in this survey predate any competing claim, and Lord Draycott's inability to produce contradicting records of his own speaks strongly to the validity of Duke Asheville's claim. I therefore order the immediate return of the disputed land, along with all associated mineral rights, to the Asheville estate, effective from this day forward, along with fair compensation for 18 years of unlawfully withheld profits from those very lands. A murmur of astonishment moved through the assembled crowd, and Alira felt Alastair's hand tighten around her own, his breath catching audibly beside her. The king was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, his gaze shifting deliberately toward Lord Draycott, given the deeply troubling circumstances surrounding this case, including credible testimony regarding a suspicious meeting the night before Duke Asheville's father's death, and an anonymous threat clearly intended to intimidate a family seeking rightful justice before this very court. I am ordering a formal royal investigation into Lord Edmund Draycott's conduct, to be conducted independently and thoroughly, with full authority to examine all relevant records and testimony. Until this investigation concludes, Lord Draycott's standing privileges at court are hereby suspended. Lord Draycott's face had gone pale, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering entirely beneath the weight of the king's ruling. He opened his mouth as though to protest, then seemed to think better of it beneath the weight of the king's unwavering gaze, offering instead only a stiff, reluctant bow before the assembled court. As the audience concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, court officials and curious nobles alike approached Alastair and Alira with expressions ranging from genuine admiration to cautious newfound respect. Names that had never once bothered to acknowledge the Asheville family's existence now sought introductions, eager to align themselves with a house whose fortunes had so dramatically and publicly begun to reverse. Edwin Caro, Alira's father's old trade associate, approached them near the palace entrance with a broad, genuine smile. "Duchess, Duke Asheville, I believe congratulations are in order. I suspect you will find no shortage of merchants eager to establish trade agreements with Asheville lands now, given today's proceedings." "Thank you, Edwin," Alira said warmly. "Your support meant a great deal to us long before today's ruling." "It was an honor," Edwin replied. "I have rarely seen a house rebuild itself so thoroughly through nothing but honest work and genuine courage. I suspect the Asheville name will carry considerable weight in trade circles for years to come." As they finally made their way back toward their carriage, Alastair paused at the palace steps, turning to look back at the grand hall behind them with an expression Alira had never before seen upon his face, something that resembled genuine peace settling gently over features that had carried quiet grief and guarded caution for as long as she had known him. 18 years, he said quietly. 18 years I believed the truth would remain buried forever, that my father's memory would forever carry the weight of unanswered questions and quiet suspicion. I never truly believed I would see this day. "You did not simply see it," Alira said, taking his hand gently in her own. "You fought for it, we fought for it together." Alastair turned to look at her, and for the first time since their difficult, transactional wedding so many months earlier, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, unhurried and full of genuine affection, there upon the palace steps in full view of the departing court. "I love you," he said quietly, when he finally pulled back. "Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for what you have done for my family's name, though I am endlessly grateful for that as well. I love you simply because you are you, Alira, because you looked at a broken, forgotten house and chose to see something worth saving." "I love you too," Alira said softly, her own eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and quiet joy. "And I believe, Alastair Asheville, that we have only just begun building what this family is truly capable of becoming." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes to Asheville Estate. The returned land, rich with valuable mineral deposits, provided an immediate and substantial boost to the family's fortunes, allowing for genuine, lasting repairs to the manor itself, proper wages for an expanding household staff, and continued investment into the tenant farms that had become the true foundation of the estate's remarkable recovery. The royal investigation into Lord Draycott's conduct progressed steadily over the following months, eventually uncovering additional evidence, including financial records confirming the very payment Samuel had witnessed exchanged the night before Alastair's father's death, evidence that ultimately led to Lord Draycott's formal removal from all remaining positions of court influence, and a substantial fine paid in restitution to the Asheville family for 18 years of wrongfully withheld resources. Throughout it all, Alira remained deeply involved in every aspect of the estate's continued growth, her sharp trading instincts and genuine care for the tenant farmers ensuring that Asheville's recovery extended fairly to every person connected to the land, rather than benefiting only the noble family at its head. Alastair, meanwhile, continued to shed the guarded caution that had defined him for so many years, gradually becoming known throughout court circles not as the Forgotten Duke, but as a man of genuine integrity and quiet strength, someone whose word could be trusted precisely, because he had spent his entire life learning the painful cost of dishonesty and silence. One evening, several months after the royal ruling, Mrs. Holt entered the study where Alastair and Alira sat together reviewing the estate's continually improving accounts, her weathered face bright with an excitement Alira had rarely seen from the normally composed housekeeper. "My lord, my lady," she said, "a formal invitation has arrived, addressed to you both, from the royal palace itself." Alastair opened the sealed letter with careful hands, his eyes widening slightly as he read its contents. "The king has requested our presence at an upcoming royal gathering," he said, glancing up at Alira with quiet astonishment. "He wishes to formally recognize the Asheville family's contributions to the kingdom's trade prosperity, given the remarkable success of the reforms we have implemented across our lands this past year." Alira felt a warm swell of pride rise within her chest, though she kept her voice characteristically practical. "Then it seems the Forgotten Duke is finally being remembered, exactly as he always deserved to be." Alastair smiled, reaching across the desk to take her hand gently in his own. "We are being remembered, Alira. This recovery has never been mine alone. It belongs to both of us equally, and to every person on this estate who believed enough in what we were building together to help us build it." Outside the study window, the estate grounds stretched wide and green beneath the late afternoon sun, tenant farms flourishing along freshly repaired roads, the manor itself gleaming with careful restoration that had returned much of its former grandeur. Though tempered now with a warmth and genuine purpose it had never fully possessed even in its most celebrated years. The Asheville name, once spoken with quiet pity or dismissive contempt, now carried a very different weight throughout the kingdom, one built not upon inherited privilege, but upon honest work, genuine partnership, and the unwavering courage to demand truth be heard, no matter how powerful those determined to keep it buried might be. The royal gathering took place beneath a clear autumn sky, the palace gardens transformed for the occasion with rows of lanterns strung between the trees and long tables laden with food far grander than anything Alira had encountered during her modest upbringing among trading families. Nobles from across the kingdom had gathered for the event, drawn by curiosity and genuine admiration for the remarkable story that had, over the past year, become one of the most talked-about tales at court, the story of a forgotten duke and the clever merchant's daughter who had rebuilt his name from nothing but ruin and quiet determination. King Edward himself rose before the assembled crowd as the evening reached its formal proceedings, his voice carrying easily across the gathered nobility. "A year ago," the king began, "few among us would have believed the Asheville name capable of the transformation we have witnessed since. A duchy once dismissed as forgotten, its lands neglected, its influence entirely vanished from meaningful court consideration, has, within a single year, become one of the most prosperous and respected trade centers within this entire kingdom. Tenant farms once struggling now produce among the finest harvests in the region. Trade routes once considered too risky for merchant investment now flow steadily with valuable goods, benefiting not merely the Asheville estate itself, but countless surrounding communities whose own fortunes have risen alongside it." The king turned his attention directly toward Alastair and Alira, who stood together near the front of the gathered crowd, Alira's hand held firmly within Alastair's own. "Duke Asheville, Duchess Asheville," the king continued, "you have demonstrated, through honest labor and unwavering integrity, precisely the qualities this kingdom values above mere inherited title or ancient bloodline. You uncovered truth where others preferred convenient silence. You rebuilt prosperity where others saw only ruin. And you did so not through political maneuvering or court favor, but through genuine partnership, fairness toward those who depend upon you, and a refusal to accept injustice simply because challenging it proved difficult." A warm murmur of approval moved through the gathered crowd, and Alira felt her chest tighten with quiet, overwhelming emotion as the king continued. It is therefore my honor before this entire court to formally recognize the Asheville Duchy's remarkable achievements, and to declare that the Asheville name shall henceforth serve as an example within this kingdom of what genuine integrity and partnership can accomplish, even against the heaviest odds. Let it be remembered from this day forward that true honor is not inherited through bloodline alone, but earned through courage, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The crowd erupted into genuine applause, far warmer and more sincere than the polite, obligatory acknowledgement such gatherings typically produced. Alira glanced up at Alastair, finding his eyes bright with emotion, the weight of 18 years finally, fully lifted from his shoulders. "Your father would be proud," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Our father," Alastair corrected gently. "You have earned every right to claim this family's legacy as your own, Alira. Everything we have built, we built together." As the formal ceremony concluded, and the evening shifted toward more casual celebration, Alira found herself approached by numerous nobles eager to establish connections with the now celebrated Asheville estate. Each conversation a small, satisfying reminder of how dramatically their fortunes had shifted from those early, difficult days when the manor had stood nearly empty, its halls echoing with silence and quiet despair. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Alastair drew Alira gently away from the crowd, toward a quiet corner of the palace gardens overlooking a moonlit fountain. "I have something I wish to give you," he said, reaching into his coat and producing a small, carefully wrapped box. Alira opened it slowly, finding inside a delicate ring set with a single, deep blue stone that matched almost exactly the color of the gown she had worn on the day of their royal audience months earlier. "Alastair," she breathed, genuinely surprised. "Our wedding was never truly ours," he said quietly, taking her hand. "It was arranged out of necessity, without ceremony, without any of the warmth a marriage between two people who genuinely love each other deserves. I wish to give you something that was entirely, freely chosen, a symbol of the marriage we have built together since, rather than the transaction that first brought us together." Alira felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes as Alastair slipped the ring gently onto her finger. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Not nearly as beautiful as what you have built here," Alastair said, his voice thick with emotion. "Alira, you arrived at Asheville Manor a stranger bound to me by nothing but desperate circumstance. You leave this evening, standing before the entire kingdom, as the woman who restored honor to a name the world had chosen to forget. I do not know how I will ever fully repay what you have given this family." "You already have," Alira said softly, resting her hand against his chest. "You gave me a home worth building, a family worth fighting for, and love I never expected to find within an arrangement that began as nothing more than necessity. That is more than enough repayment for a lifetime, Alastair." They remained together beside the moonlit fountain a while longer, the sounds of celebration drifting softly around them. Two people who had entered a difficult, uncertain arrangement nearly a year earlier and emerged, against every expectation, having built something far stronger and more meaningful than either could have imagined possible. In the months that followed, the Asheville estate continued its remarkable rise, its trade influence expanding steadily throughout the kingdom, its tenant farms serving as a model for fair and prosperous land management that other noble houses soon began studying and attempting to replicate. Lord Draycott's formal disgrace concluded with his complete removal from court influence, his family's remaining holdings significantly reduced through the ongoing royal investigation, a stark and permanent reminder that even the most carefully maintained power could not forever withstand the persistent pursuit of truth. As for the Asheville name, it grew, within the span of a single remarkable year, from a title spoken with quiet pity into one regarded throughout the kingdom with genuine admiration and respect. A name whose honor, built through honest partnership rather than inherited privilege, would eventually be spoken with more reverence than that of the king's own extended family, precisely as the humble beginnings of Alira and Alastair's difficult, transactional marriage could never have predicted. But their unwavering courage and genuine love for one another had ultimately, undeniably, made true. And so the forgotten Duke was forgotten no longer, remembered instead as a man who had found, within an arrangement born of desperation, both the truth that had eluded him for 18 long years, and a love more enduring than any title or fortune the kingdom could ever bestow. 3 years passed, and Asheville Manor bore little resemblance to the crumbling, forgotten house Alira had first arrived at on that cold, misty morning so long ago. The stone walls had been fully restored, the ivy trimmed back to reveal handsome gray stone that gleamed after every rainfall rather than hiding beneath decay. The gardens, once overgrown and untended, now bloomed with careful cultivation, tended by a staff that had grown from 3 loyal servants into a household of nearly 30, each person treated with the same fairness and respect Alira had insisted upon from her very first morning in that kitchen with Greta. The tenant farms surrounding the estate had become something of a legend among neighboring duchies. Their innovative rotation methods and fair rent arrangements, studied by land stewards from distant corners of the kingdom, hoping to replicate Asheville's remarkable prosperity. Young farmers who had once considered leaving the region entirely, unable to make a reasonable living from exhausted soil and unfair rents, now raised their families proudly upon land that finally rewarded their labor honestly. Alira stood one autumn morning upon the manor's front steps, watching a young boy of 2 chase a wooden toy horse across the freshly swept courtyard, his laughter bright and unrestrained beneath the golden morning light. Their son, Edmund Alastair Asheville, named in quiet, deliberate defiance of the very man who had once tried so hard to keep the Asheville name buried, tumbled happily onto the grass, undeterred by his own clumsy stumble. "He grows more like you every day," Alastair said, coming to stand beside her, watching their son with the same quiet warmth that had become permanently fixed upon his face over the years since their difficult beginning. Stubborn, fearless, and entirely unwilling to accept defeat, even against a wooden toy horse twice his size. "He has your patience, at least," Alira said, laughing softly, "though I confess I see very little evidence of it most mornings." Alastair wrapped an arm gently around her waist, the two of them watching their son continue his determined chase across the courtyard. "Do you ever think back to that first morning," he asked quietly, "when you arrived here believing you were walking into nothing but obligation and ruin?" "Often," Alira admitted, "though it feels now like it happened to entirely different people. I barely recognized the frightened, determined girl who stepped down from that carriage, certain she was walking toward nothing but hardship. I barely recognized the guarded, hopeless man who greeted her at these very steps," Alastair said. "You changed everything, Alira. Not simply the estate, though that alone would have been remarkable enough. You changed who I believed I was capable of becoming." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider bearing fresh correspondence, a common occurrence these days given the estate's expanding influence throughout the kingdom's trade circles. Among the letters was one bearing an unfamiliar seal, requesting a meeting regarding a new venture, an ambitious proposal to establish a formal trading academy within Asheville lands, teaching practical business and agricultural management to young men and women from families of modest means who might never otherwise gain access to such valuable knowledge. Alira read the proposal with growing excitement, recognizing immediately an opportunity to extend the philosophy that had rebuilt Asheville's fortunes far beyond their own estate's borders. "This could change a great deal for families throughout the region," she said, showing the letter to Alastair. "Imagine how many struggling estates might be transformed if their stewards understood even half of what we have learned rebuilding our own lands." "Then let us build it," Alastair said, without hesitation. "We know better than anyone how much genuine opportunity can accomplish, given the chance to take root." Within the year, the Asheville Trading Academy opened its doors, welcoming its first modest class of eager students drawn from farming families and struggling merchant houses across the surrounding region. Alira taught several courses herself, drawing upon her own practical trading knowledge. while Alastair oversaw the Academy's broader operations, finding within the work a genuine sense of purpose that extended far beyond simply restoring his own family's fortunes. Lord Draycott, meanwhile, lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity, stripped of nearly all meaningful influence, his name occasionally mentioned in hushed, cautionary tones, as an example of what became of those who mistook power for permanence. His daughter, Lady Priscilla, eventually married into a distant, minor noble house, disappearing largely from the fashionable court circles that had once seemed so central to her family's identity. The Asheville name, by contrast, continued its remarkable ascent throughout the kingdom, its reputation built not upon ancient title or inherited privilege, but upon the genuine partnership, integrity, and unwavering fairness that Alira and Alastair had woven into every aspect of their estate's remarkable recovery. Young nobles seeking guidance on estate management traveled from distant corners of the kingdom to study Asheville's methods firsthand. Merchants considered a trade agreement bearing the Asheville seal among the most trustworthy arrangements available anywhere within the realm. Years later, when historians and storytellers spoke of the great houses that had shaped the kingdom's prosperity during that remarkable era, they spoke of Asheville not as a footnote or a minor curiosity, but as the very example against which other noble houses measured their own legacies. The forgotten duke, they said, had become something far greater than simply remembered. He had become, alongside the clever, determined Duchess who had refused to let his family's name remain buried beneath old lies and quiet injustice, a name spoken with more genuine honor and respect throughout the kingdom than that of the crown's own extended family, precisely as the story's telling had always promised it eventually would. And within the walls of Asheville Manor itself, restored now to a warmth and prosperity it had never fully possessed even in its most celebrated generations past, Alira and Alastair continued building their life together, one honest harvest, one fair trade agreement, and one small, determined act of courage at a time, exactly as they always had, from that very first difficult morning when a stranger's carriage had rattled through crumbling iron gates, carrying with it a woman who refused to let a forgotten house remain forgotten any longer.